Thank you, Mahmoud. This is a really once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for me. I've been on tour since October, and this is one of the most special events. So I get to have some of the people who are in the book here. Liz and Rafi Magnus, for example. We're in the last chapter on luxury refugees, so it's nice to see you guys here. I wasn't sure I would make this talk because all my friends were telling me after writing this book I wouldn't be let in. But as I wrote in the book, being a Jewish American always helps me get through the Israeli-controlled frontiers, and that was the case as I entered here, unlike so many Palestinian American friends of mine who at least putatively enjoy the same rights as me in the United States, but when we're here they often have to beseech me to sneak them into certain places that they have much more of a connection to than I do. I have about, this went out. Hello. I'll speak without the microphone. I have about as much connection to this place as an American Jew as the San Francisco-based Creedence Clearwater Revival had to the Bayou. And you know, that's an inside American joke. And so I really approach this situation as an outsider, as you know, as a Jew, but as an American, as a foreign correspondent with an emphasis on the foreign. And I did make it in also despite being the #9 anti-Israel, anti-Semite on the Simon Wiesenthal Center's annual list. I was tied with Alice Walker, which was a big honor. My mother was really proud of that. And I was right behind European sports venues, which was #8. And you know, as an American Jew, I always strive to do my best. I'm very ambitious. So next year I'm trying to make it to #1. But I have some very stiff competition because #1 was Ayatollah Khomeini. So we'll see what we can do here. My book, which, as I said, was released in October 2013, to your question, Mahmoud, I think it provides the backdrop for understanding the situation that all of us, especially those of you who live here, find yourselves in right now. It's really an exploration from as close, an intimate, on-the-ground exploration of Israeli society, understanding the political and societal trends that are driving the one entity, the one force that controls everyone's lives between the river and the sea with varying matrices of control. Particularly, my book touched on the mainstreaming of right-wing racism and eliminationist attitudes and how they've been inculcated among Jewish Israelis, particularly young Jewish Israelis. My book opens with Operation Cast Lead, which was the second to last, quote-unquote, operation against the Gaza Strip. Something I could probably characterize as an one-sided slaughter. 1,400 or more were dead, most women and children, according to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And this attack took place during the national elections in Israel. So it kind of propelled figures like Avigdor Lieberman, the leader of the Israel Beitenu party, who is pledging to lessen the citizenship rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel. It propelled him into the foreign ministry as Israel's top diplomat. It propelled Benjamin Netanyahu to victory, and Netanyahu now occupies Israel's hollow center as he's pushed from the right by the post-Oslo generation of young Likudniks and the Jewish Home Party. I described the anti-democratic laws that were flowing through the Knesset, targeting not just Palestinian citizens of Israel with the Nakba law, which imposes penalties on municipalities that observe Palestinian dispossession, or the Acceptance to Communities law, which allows communities of under 500 to discriminate on the basis of race or religion, but also laws targeting Jewish Israeli dissidents, liberal Israelis, including groups like B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence, seeking to sap them of their funding. Extremism in the Knesset was a theme that I touched on, particularly around Hanin Zoabi's return from the Mavi Marmara Free Gaza Flotilla, how she was nearly attacked in the Knesset. Afterwards, Anastasia Michaeli, who is this sort of dominatrix of the Israel Beitenu party, former Miss St. Petersburg, recruited by Lieberman, handed Zoabi an Iranian passport and told her to basically go to Iran as if she has some kind of connection to the place. The government and media manipulation of the public to generate support for disproportionate violence, not only against Palestinians, but also against international activists, was something we witnessed with the Mavi Marmara, which I explored in depth in my book. All these hoaxes that emerged from the Israeli Army spokesman's office, which were pumped right through the media, including through newspapers like Haaretz. Fabricated audio tapes from the Mavi Marmara declaring "go back to Auschwitz" were pumped into the Israeli psyche, generating this mass hysteria after 9 activists were killed. The indoctrination of Jewish Israeli youth with racist and militaristic attitudes was a key theme in my book, and I explored the education system. My guides for this subject were often the Women of New Profile, which is an organization of radical Jewish Israeli feminists, mostly middle-class women from Tel Aviv, who found themselves being called in for interrogations and having their computers seized because they were helping counsel questioning Jewish Israeli youth out of doing army service and trying to educate people into a kind of civilian mentality instead of this mentality of being a soldier. And I discussed how the Holocaust and historic Jewish persecution is used to inculcate these racist attitudes through sending for about 25% of Jewish Israeli high schoolers on the March of the Living to Auschwitz, which is really used actually and monitored by the Israeli Education Ministry to implant these militaristic attitudes, to build support for the army, to build support for the state of Israel, when, as all teens throughout the world do, these Israeli young people express skeptical attitudes. It's to turn off their skepticism. I detailed the mob violence that we're seeing across Jerusalem, that we've seen over the past weeks, and how it was really tested. These methods were tested on non-Jewish Africans, the 60,000 refugees who have failed to obtain asylum in the state of Israel because, unlike me, they don't possess J-positive blood. They've been rounded up and put in camps, Saharonim and Holot, camps where they're being concentrated, according to Arnon Sofer, the Israeli government demographic advisor's advice, that they be concentrated in camps on their way towards deportation, and they're being indefinitely concentrated there. The mob violence spilled out into Jerusalem with encouragement from state-funded rabbis like Dov Lior, like Yitzhak Shapira, the publisher of Torat HaMelech, a book which sold more copies in Israel than possibly Peter Beinart's The Crisis of Zionism sold in the United States. This is a book that, according to the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv, was a guide for when it is permissible to kill Gentiles, to kill non-Jews. It declares that it is permissible to kill non-Jewish children if they will be deemed to grow up to harm us. In other words, if they'll grow up to be terrorists, to join Hamas. And it's been distributed throughout the army, ranks of the religious nationalist soldiers in the army that come out of the Hester yeshivas by the hundreds, if not the thousands. Right-wing mob violence, the epicenter was Zion Square, where Jamal Julani was attacked in 2012. A 19-year-old Palestinian was beaten into a coma. His perpetrators boasted about the attack at the courthouse, I think at the Russian compound, and declared that one of them declared his only regret was that Julani wasn't killed. Mysteriously, the closed-circuit TV footage of the beating disappeared. And this, is all a backdrop to, I think, a lot of scenes of horror that you have all witnessed in the past few weeks. The rise of the anti-miscegenation movement in Jerusalem and throughout Israel under the banner of Lahava, which is really a reincarnation of the Kahanist Jewish Defense League and Kach, was also a factor in driving right-wing mob violence. This is a group that received almost a de facto endorsement from scores of state-funded Israeli rabbis who signed a letter, an official rabbinical edict, and a complete perversion of Jewish law, declaring that it is illegal under halachic law to rent apartments to non-Jews. Their wives signed a letter declaring it is illegal under Jewish law for non-Jews and Jews to have relationships. They were even called into the Knesset to testify by Deputy Transportation Minister Tzipi Hotovely, who I consider to be kind of like the Sarah Palin of Israel, except she speaks better English than Sarah Palin. A rising star in the Likud party who's very telegenic and presentable, and we'll keep hearing a lot from her as long as the situation remains the same. The violent repression of the popular struggle in the West Bank, the roundups of teens and children, and trying them in Ofer military court was something that I detailed in my book, how it was used to break an unarmed popular struggle that really represented one of the attempts to reincarnate the First Intifada. And the repression and crushing of dissent in Jewish Israeli society, targeting groups like Anarchists Against the Wall, through the Shabak, and right-wing street-level groups like Im Tirtzu, which have received endorsements from Benjamin Netanyahu and operate freely despite their classification by a court, an Israeli court, as a fascist group. These trends I've described throughout the past 6 or 7 months since October, going from every hen house to every outhouse to field house across the United States to talk about it. Anyone who would host me, I wasn't welcomed into a synagogue for some reason. But I spoke in a lot of mosques. I don't know why they don't want to hear about what's happening here. And I said everywhere I went that these trends would intensify, the horrors would increase and spill over as long as the status quo continued, as long as the status quo guaranteed and ensured by Barack Obama, the president who has been the most submissive to Israeli right-wing extremism in history, continued to protect Israel and shield it from outside scrutiny. And now we see that the trends of open racism, the trends of apartheid, have been taken to new heights this summer. The reality after this summer will be forever altered here and internationally. And this summer, I consider to be kind of the postscript to Goliath. Actually, some of the things I've witnessed this summer, even though I not being so much of a genius like many of you could foresee this coming, have really shocked me to my core and brought me to a point of despair. The backdrop for this summer was the collapse of John Kerry's framework agreement, or what John Kerry called a framework for a framework, because it really was a completely hollow gesture that was basically devised by the Israelis without any consultation with Palestinian society. In any case, it wasn't enough for Netanyahu. It wasn't enough for the right-wingers in his coalition. It certainly wasn't enough for Naftali Bennett and the Jewish Home Party. It collapsed, and Martin Indyk, a former staffer, a former researcher for AIPAC, the key arm of the Israel lobby in the US, someone who said at J Street's annual conference in 2009 that he made aliyah from the UK to the US to protect Israel's security imperatives from within Washington. Martin Indyk went to Nahum Barnea, one of Israel's top columnists, and blamed Netanyahu and blamed Israel for the collapse of the peace process, exposing Netanyahu for the first time to blame from the US. Following that, there were the Betunia killings outside the Ofer military prison, captured on closed caption TV, 2 Palestinian youth who apparently were completely unarmed and not necessarily involved in any of the clashes were killed kind of execution style by an Israeli sniper. I don't know what happened to him. He seems to have been unpunished. But this footage made its way back to the US, and Michael Oren, who is then identified as a CNN analyst, was forced to explain before Wolf Blitzer, another former AIPAC staffer, why these youth were killed, and he said maybe they shot themselves. It was Pallywood, as they say. So it just looked ridiculous. Israel was being exposed, and there was no clear end in sight. So the liberal Zionists in the U.S. were looking at this and wondering, is the two-state solution dead? Is it apartheid? Can we expect just another right-winger after Netanyahu? What do we do? The crisis was beginning to grow. On June 11th, Israel attacked the Gaza Strip. On June 11th. I don't know why. It was just another ceasefire violation, one of hundreds upon hundreds of violations of the 2012 ceasefire that was signed after Operation Pillar of Cloud. On June 12th, 3 Israeli teens were kidnapped, at a settlement after attending yeshiva. They were hitchhiking on their way home. This is fairly close to Hebron. Within hours of the kidnapping, Benjamin Netanyahu and the Shin Bet and the Israeli police were presented with a recording of a phone call from the teens to the Israeli police in which gunshots were heard. The purported kidnappers, alleged kidnappers, celebrated what appeared to be the killing of the 3 teens after discovering that they were attempting to find help. Netanyahu, the police, the Shabak knew that the teens were dead. Not only that, within 24 hours, and this was reported in Palestinian media while Israeli media was put under a Shin Bet gag order approved by the Israeli military in an Israeli court. Within 24 hours, the Israeli police, the Shin Bet, and Netanyahu knew the names of the 2 suspected killers, Marwan Kawazme, and the other was Abu Aisha, was his last name. And these were 2 figures who have long affiliations with a rogue Hamas cell. And the Kawazme, there have been many attacks carried out by people affiliated with the Kawazme clan that have contradicted Hamas political imperatives and been carried out by ceasefires. It looked very fishy. The police lied to the parents of the 3 teens and told them they were still alive. They told them there was no blood and no DNA found in the car when there was. The mother of one of the teens, Naftali Frankel, heard the gunshots and said, "What were those?" And they said they were blanks. And then they proceeded to send one of the mothers to the UN Human Rights Council to call for bringing our boys back. The Israeli Foreign Ministry and the 10,000 talkers of Israel's Hasbara Brigade deployed the Bring Back Our Boys hashtag, calling on the world to support the rescue mission known as Operation Brother's Keeper, which was not a rescue mission at all, under the political cover that Israel received from the US, with John Kerry wrongly and falsely blaming Hamas and Hamas's political cadre for ordering this kidnapping, right after a unity agreement had been signed, something that contradicted Hamas's apparent political goals. Israel proceeded to rampage through the West Bank, centering in on Hamas's political membership with full permission from the Palestinian Authority and support from the Sulta, support from the Palestinian security forces in Ramallah. Palestinian security forces joined the Israeli army in attacking Shabab, young men from Ramallah actually attempting to resist the onslaught. 500 arrests were carried out, 50 were re-arrested who had been released in the Gilad Shalit deal. This was an operation approved by Netanyahu, the arrest of those who had been released, reneging on that deal. 1,500 homes were raided. 200, I think, are still in jail under administrative detention without charges. A war had begun. This was an attack on Hamas's political organization, or what was left of it, in the West Bank. When the bodies were discovered of the 3 Israeli teens, 2 weeks later, I believe, Netanyahu, who already knew that they were dead moments after they were kidnapped, released a statement, first to the Israeli cabinet and then to the world through his Twitter account, which was pure, cold-blooded incitement, declaring that all of Hamas was responsible and that those who were responsible were human animals, dehumanizing anyone who could be connected to this. Meaning all of Hamas, meaning, well, what does Hamas control? The Gaza Strip. We knew it was next. Most disturbingly, Netanyahu quoted from a poem by the turn-of-the-century scribe Chaim Bialik. He declared, "Vengeance for the blood of a small child, Satan has not yet created." This was a line from the poem On the Slaughter, about the pogrom in, I believe, 1908 in the city of Kishinev, in the Pale of Settlement, where my family is from, where my family basically was dispossessed and fled from. Bialik followed his first account of Kishinev with an even stronger poem, and this is important to understand Netanyahu and where he's coming from. It was called The City of the Slaughter, and it was an incendiary work admonishing the victims of the pogrom, actually laying into those who were slaughtered for their supposed passivity in the face of these armed anti-Semitic marauders. They went like sheep to the slaughter. And he conveniently overlooked the reports of ferocious resistance by Jewish locals. The poem helped radicalize thousands of young Jews across Eastern Europe and inspired the formation of self-defense committees across Europe. And most importantly, it won waves of adherence to the then militant philosophy of Zionism. Among those most influenced by Bialik and this poem was Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was, of course, the right-wing Zionist activist who later became the political benefactor to Netanyahu. Denial of American Jews of what's happening here is most pernicious among the baby boom generation that was, I would say, radicalized, although many identify themselves as liberal Zionists, I would say radicalized by the 1967 war and went through those events. And this idea of kind of, Jewish strength during the 60s as they were coming of age politically. And all the polls back that up, that the baby boom generation of Jews is the most resistant to critiques or a critical view of Israel. Now, they're different from Jewish Israelis who are experiencing the situation directly and who are subjected to really nonstop indoctrination through the education system, through the media, and have to participate in the army. For American Jews, it's an issue of identity. You're secular, most likely, so you're not really that into religion. Going to shul on Friday night's boring. You want to watch The Daily Show and hang out with your friends. You're affluent. There's no anti-Semitism. You have a lot of different kinds of friends. Maybe you're like dating a non-Jew. You have to kind of go to J-Date to like deliberately find a Jewish partner. You're in this whole multicultural, somewhat democratic reality, and you're secular, and you want something to identify with. Well, Israel is the most easily available thing for a secular American Jew, and when you take Israel away from them, then you take away their Jewish identity, and all of a sudden you're just another affluent white person in America, and that is very frightening. I went through that myself for maybe a few months. I tried out being a liberal Zionist. I just didn't like it a lot because it was like, it's bogus. But 300,000 American Jews have gone on the birthright trip, the Taglit trip, which is a free trip for all American Jews 18 through 25 to Israel. And this has a powerful effect on them, even if almost none of them immigrate and none of them want to do army. It has a powerful effect on their identity. Why don't they do some Jewish communal activity in the U.S. for free? Why doesn't Michael Steinhardt and why don't Michael Steinhardt and Sheldon Adelson send them somewhere in the U.S.? It's because there's nothing that could appeal to them otherwise, and so it's almost like they've constructed an artificial Jewish identity around this pillar of Zionism. Another reason that Jews are able to maintain this cocoon in the United States is that the issues we're discussing here are never discussed. There's no context provided to them. Palestinian voices are fairly off limits in the media, although things are moderately changing now. And Zionism, the idea of Zionism is never engaged. Peter Beinart has written about the Jewish American cocoon, but every time he writes about it and he criticizes the Jewish establishment and then declares that we need to save Zionism. He wrote a book called The Crisis of Zionism. The book should be called The Crisis is Zionism, because Jewish Americans wouldn't like Zionism if they knew what it really was and what its goals were, which is an ethnically pure, hermetically sealed Spartan state for Jews only. And that's not the reality that they want in the United States. This contradiction is coming to the fore. One of the most interesting things we're witnessing, particularly in New York, is the rise of this group, which I don't fully support, but it's an interesting group called If Not Now. It's mostly consists of career Jewish liberal organizers and public relations professionals who had mostly been affiliated with the main liberal Zionist group in the U.S., J Street, and they're now getting arrested in front of the Jewish federations and in front of the Israeli consulate wearing black to protest the massacre in Gaza. That's really interesting. Meanwhile, you have Jeremy Ben-Ami tendering a six-figure salary at J Street with funding from Grover Norquist, supporting the attack on the Gaza Strip. There's clearly a generational shift. Do I relate to the opposing forces I mean, Kobe Snitz is part of the opposing forces. These 700 are part of the opposing forces. But you can't consider yourself an opposing force within Israeli society unless you are actually opposing Zionism and the idea of the Jewish state, which is at the root of the crisis. And that's what these people are doing. They're leveling their bodies against the occupation. They're bearing witness in the military courts. And then you have these other groups which are, and I have great respect for Breaking the Silence and what they do, and B'Tselem. They produce a lot of important documentation, but they often provide cover for the Israeli government as well, to say that we have these human rights groups that we're accountable to. And then you have Isaac Herzog, Bougie Herzog, who's the head of the Labour Party, who's become basically the Hasbara minister for Benjamin Netanyahu. He's supposed to be the head of the opposition. And he recently attacked Dr. Mads Gilbert and the Norwegian doctors at Al-Shifa Hospital, claiming that they were covering up the fact that there were missiles under the hospital. This is the language we're hearing from the opposition party in Israel. So I don't think there's any possibility for change from within. This has been a mantra of Meretz as it sent its young members into the army to tell them to try to limit the violence of their comrades in the units. It didn't happen. Didn't work. I discussed this theme at length in my book. It's why I've decided to support BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The only way that the situation on the ground will change here is through external pressure. And that's what BDS aims to do, to fill the void that's been created by our governments, particularly the US government, which is accountable only to the 1%. Israel is a strategic asset to the global 1%. And those are the funders of the Democratic Party. Haim Saban, one of the top donors to Barack Obama, is also a supporter of Netanyahu and the Israeli government. His wife got a special UN position from Obama after donating $1 million to a pro-Obama super PAC. And Saban has said, my one issue is Israel. Michael Bloomberg, who was just here to protest the FAA ban on flights to Ben Gurion, is the second largest donor to Democratic candidates through his Independence PAC. He's actually visited Israel more times than he visited the South Bronx as mayor of New York. He's donating on the basis of gun control, but there's a ricochet effect. If you vote against appropriations bill funding for Iron Dome, you might not get that donation from Mike Bloomberg around election time, and you'll be overwhelmed by your Republican opponent who's getting Koch brothers money from American Crossroads or whatever. So that's the situation, and that's why BDS is so important. I mean, you had 100-0 in the US Senate in favor of the massacre in Gaza, 100-0 in favor of the attack on Shujaia, 100-0 in favor of the attack on Khuza. And when Elizabeth Warren, the hero of all liberals in the US, was asked about Gaza, she said, I don't have time for you. An international crisis, and she doesn't have time. When Bernie Sanders, the socialist from Vermont, was asked about his support for the massacre in Gaza, his vote in favor, he said, well, that's not where my mind is right now. A lot of our minds are there, and you're going to have to organize if you want things to change. Quickly about the Jewish Israelis who are refusing to return for reserve duty. And my solution, everybody runs across the street and sings Kumbaya. No. Let me get to that after this question. What I read in Haaretz last year that 10,000 Israelis had actually been jailed for not doing reserve duty.
They don't have to if they're overseas.
I read a bizarre article.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's that high, but what I can say is that the reason that New Profile finds itself under such attack is because there is a lower conscription rate. It's now at 75% and even below, when a decade or two ago it was at 90%. And that's not necessarily because 15% of Jewish Israelis are signing up to become Shministim and taking a stand and going to jail for 30 days. It's because the army just might not feel right for them, and they just want a way out. And that's what New Profile said. They said, we'll help you get out any way that, for whatever reason you want. And that's another reason why we're seeing intensified indoctrination in the education system, with promotion of military values, replacement of civic studies programs for high schoolers with the teaching of Jewish studies programs, field trips to occupied Hebron. It all relates to lower conscription. So there is a crisis of lower conscription, but it's happening below the radar, and you're right, it deserves more research that I haven't done. My solution, I mean, I can't, who am I to offer a solution? I have no influence, but I think everyone would like to see a solution where a society is created without ethnic or religious preferences. I think that would end the conflict if people were given rights. The issue is not, the solution is not through land for peace. It's through giving rights to people, including refugees. Palestinians should be able to vote in Palestinian national elections. The Palestinian diaspora should be involved. And there, you know, I'm not going to go through a long, I always get in trouble when I go through a long fantasy about how things can be resolved. But I think that the BDS tactic provides a path towards a solution, though it doesn't preclude whether it's 2 states or confederation or 1 state, but it's oriented around rights. The idea of giving Palestinians rights guaranteed by international law. I set up this event through Mahmoud and the Educational Bookstore, and I really respect the work that he's doing. And I would not do an event that was not in East Jerusalem or the West Bank. I wouldn't have done an event in West Jerusalem or within the Green Line, Israel, because I would consider that to be a violation of BDS. I think it's important to demonstrate non-compliance, and I think the most important part of the boycott is the cultural boycott, but I think it's up for debate whether these sort of events can continue or not. I mean, this is an occupied Palestinian area, and